One, two.
You're the best I know.
Excellent. Well, hi folks on Zoom. It's Chelsea Day once again for a breakdown of that bill. And I'm going to turn my attention over to the IG Live for folks who are joining on there. But get comfortable. We will go ahead and start in a minute. Okay. Hello, it is Chelsea Dade, creator and executive director of Communicate for Health Justice. And we are back once again for another episode or, look at a bill. And this week we're focused on climate change and Build Back Better. So for folks who are on, for folks who are on the IG Live, the way that this works is I just use some of the screenshots from my slide deck, and then folks who are on the Zoom are participating more in the traditional way. So yeah, you can join from multiple areas. So for people who are here, I see someone else is joining. Wonderful, wonderful. So for folks who are not familiar, again, Chelsea Dade, creator and executive director of Communicate for Health Justice, which is a millennial-driven health communication business and consulting agency that's focusing on bringing health equity and social justice concepts into traditional health communication ideas. So we've been around since 2018 officially, and now focusing on kind of this consulting piece to be able to really bring about the next generation of health communicators. So very exciting. I love being a part of the change, and that's really what we're doing here. On to the next slide here. So I mentioned a little bit about the mission and the vision really of Communicate for Health Justice is that hopefully in 5 years, I say 10 years, but hopefully in 5 years that we can really reinvigorate health communication to be racially centered and focused on all the different not so much on the disparities themselves, but what are the strengths and what are the unique cultural and social attributes that we should really focus in on rather than looking so much at deficits. And I think there's a lot of that currently in public health, but also in the way that we communicate about health. So that's really the hope and the vision for it. Looks like someone is connecting to audio still. That's totally fine. So I mentioned that we were initially launched as a blog in 2018. This year, we've taken this approach to also kind of function as a consulting agency. And so if people are interested in, participating in that manner, I encourage you to reach out, communicateforjustice@gmail.com. But really the target audiences are the audiences of communicate for all justice. It's really broad. I'm happy to consult with a lot of different folks, whether they work at public health departments or technology companies or anything in between, because all together we can do this work very effectively. So excellent, excellent. Moving on to our slides. So let me just pull these up. Making sure I am in line. Okay. So this week's topic, as I previously mentioned, is focused on Build Back Better. So very loosely, kind of the overall, description of Build Back Better, it is the kind of plan or package that President Biden, as well as certain folks in Congress have put together to really bring us as a society, American society, out of COVID in a positive economic light. So during COVID, but then also it's looking at how do we prepare and support our communities after COVID. And so that's kind of a very general overview of it. But go to my next slide. If that is not all. So, and it's important when we're looking at climate change and Build Back Better and how they're interconnected, it's important to look and start at the beginning. And so President Biden's, Build Back Better was initially proposed as an economic plan in 2020. It's gone through many iterations, and I'm sure, folks know. But its purpose, as I mentioned earlier, was to really revitalize the US economy in response to COVID, but then also afterwards. So the climate piece is largely a part of the American Jobs Plan. So it's one piece of Build Back Better, and it calls for overall cleaner energy and clean electricity through many different means. And so I think I have some of those listed out later. So even though Build Back Better was passed in the House last year, it stalled in the Senate, and this has been the case for months. But now we fast forward to earlier this month, I believe it was this month. If it's not, it was June. The Supreme Court had their decision in West Virginia versus the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which essentially limited the scope of the agency's regulatory powers within broader implications for all federal rulemaking on the climate. So they're essentially limiting how much EPA can do, which is not good, clearly. But it's not hard to imagine the potential drawbacks of this. So, and that's what we're going to kind of get into a little bit. But I also encourage folks that, to think about some of these issues on your own time. So for people who are in the Zoom, I'm going to play the video, and then what I do is I mute, I mute, and then you're able to listen in if you're on the Instagram. So 1 second.
The Supreme Court's 6 conservative justices recently ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the authority to broadly regulate carbon emissions from power plants. It's one of the most important environmental cases in years, and it's a serious blow to President Joe Biden's efforts to combat climate change. He's promised to cut the country's greenhouse gas emissions by at least half by the end of the decade, and this decision could make that goal harder to achieve. This is a weird case because it's about a regulation that doesn't exist anymore.
There is such a thing as being too late when it comes to climate change.
Back in 2015, President Barack Obama announced a new initiative called the Clean Power Plan. It was designed to reduce carbon emissions from power plants by giving each state a goal to limit emissions by, say, switching from coal to renewable sources of energy. but it never went into effect. That's because in 2016, the Supreme Court voted to temporarily block the rule. Now, you might think that would be the end of the story, but more than 20 states and hundreds of companies and industry groups kept arguing with the federal government over the regulation even after Obama left office. They claimed that the EPA doesn't have the authority to pass regulations that would reshape an entire industry. In the Supreme Court's recent decision, they said industry was right. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts said that when agencies are taking actions on big issues that have a major economic and political impact, they need a clear directive from Congress. So, regulating individual power plants is still an option for the EPA, but regulating the entire industry is not. This is not good news for Biden. His efforts to slow climate change are not going particularly well. Democrats tried to include several provisions to address the issue in Build Back Better, the massive piece of legislation that died in the Senate in December. With Congress seemingly unable to do anything, issuing regulations through the EPA is the main way the Biden administration can fight climate change, at least right now. This decision didn't completely tie the agency's hands, but it will make their task harder. And it could potentially have ramifications for other federal agencies' ability to regulate industry. Gallup polling over the past few decades has found that Americans pretty consistently want the government to prioritize environmental protection, even if it slows economic growth. A majority are concerned about global warming and are increasingly likely to think it will pose a serious threat in their lifetime. But does that mean this decision will be unpopular? That's harder to say. This is the kind of case that's just complicated enough to make people tune out. So the question is really whether people will hear about the ruling and whether they'll understand what it actually means for the government's ability to address climate change. If you liked this video and want to learn
here. So yes, and that video was from 5:38. If you're interested in watching it or learning more. So yeah, I included that because when I was doing the initial research for this discussion, it felt not empty. It felt like I wouldn't necessarily include everything that needed to be centered if I didn't look at the EPA decision and, in addition to Build Back Better. And so a lot of people don't necessarily know. I think it did get some attention, the EPA decision, but maybe not as much, I think, as maybe it should have, because if the EPA is limited in their ability to, make decisions, then, and we don't have that through Congress, then we're not in a great place.
the Supreme Court's 6 conservative justices.
Next slide. All right, so moving on to the next slide on here. And thank you all for your patience. It's a very different way to do a slideshow on IG Live, but still effective, I believe. Okay. All right. Okay. So key things to know. Build Back Better, as I'm sure some of you are familiar. It is a very progressive, plan, but it also included a lot of progressive climate provisions, and those are stalled in Congress, as previously mentioned. And so very recently, I think it was on Wednesday, President Biden mentioned that he will be planning on taking control through executive actions in this space. But he did stop short of calling an official emergency. So that would afford him traditional policy powers, but he did stop short of that. And so important to address that there. A lot of activists in the environmental justice space would like him to call for that emergency, but he has not quite yet. All right. Let's see here. So the proposed acts that President Biden mentioned on Wednesday specifically, at least from what I heard, and then I also I went to the White House, what's the word? Website to see what other things were mentioned. So those include low cost energy projects, which is kind of broad, but I'm sure that will be, broken down a little bit more. Storm insurance for people who are living in areas with very heavy flooding, which we're seeing a lot of. And then investments in offshore wind. That was something I had to look up more because I wasn't super familiar. But I do encourage people, if you're not familiar with some of these terms, absolutely totally fine to do some more research. It's more important to, at least in my humble opinion, to do some research on these topics if you're not familiar, so you at least have some understanding. Because it is, it's our planet, it's our future, and our the children who come after us, it's their future as well. So and then finally, also community cooling centers in schools and probably other public places, because it's very, very important. So I think that's all I wanted to say on that slide. So this is the part, let me go pull up my slide change here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let me just take all the slides here. And then we go to, I think it's this one. Excellent. Okay. So first question is part of bringing health communication to, these bills that we're addressing is understanding the topic based on the way I described it, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. If you were able to read the links that I sent prior to this, did it make sense to you? Could you explain it to somebody else? These are just ways to begin to think about how do we communicate about the decisions that impact our health, and are we doing it in a manner that makes sense to people around us? For climate justice purposes, and I'm laughing because I recently did a presentation about this topic, and I will link it after we finish. But there's a lot to think about, I think, when it comes to climate justice, and not all of us are really prepared to have that full discussion. But I saw an environmental activist recently put up a quote regarding this topic, and she basically mentioned that you don't have to necessarily have all the answers, you just have to care. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of parallels between this and what we were talking about last week, which is reproductive justice, but specifically maternal mortality and how it's affecting Black women. You might not know all the specifics to the issue, but it's still important to address it, or at least try to be informed about it. Okay. The second, I don't think I have it in my phone here. Let me see. I do not, that's fine. So the other part of break down that bill is an activity. And so, try to think about how you would explain, not break down this bill, Build Back Better. A lot of alliteration in there. But try to think about how you would explain it to someone who has a varying political opinion than yours. And that's really the activity that I call for you to do if you're here or you're watching this later. And that's part of the activist action plan that I'll link to later as well. But this slide right here, we're talking about health equity, social justice, because that is really the bread and butter of Communicate for Health Justice. So the question really is, where do we see health equity and social justice in the national conversation about Build Back Better? I know, and I meant to do a little bit more digging, but I will link to it later. I'll link to it later on if folks are interested. But I know that at one point there was discussion around whether or not to include environmental racism or even just racism in this information or policy around climate justice. because it could be quote unquote triggering for people who felt attacked by the word racism. I mean, if you've been following this platform, you know I will use the term racism in other terms, because that's part of getting to the issue at present. So that's one piece, and that's purely communication. I mean, how are we talking about this issue? Are we using the words that activists use? Or are we trying to kind of shield it and make it appear some type of way? So there's that communication kind of lane there. And then the other piece is just, where are these resources that the president is talking about? Where are they going to go? There's a lot of talk, I think, right now, specifically around climate change and climate justice. But I'm sure me and others would definitely want to see more action, I think, in this space. So that's what I would offer with that. Let's see. Next slide. So applicability, where do we see this successfully passing in Congress in our current climate? I mean, not if any of the kind of rejection of this by Senator Manchin, just being specific. I don't think, based on how he's interacting with this legislation, that it could necessarily be passed. So I think they might have to go back to the drawing board with this. But that's Congress. So then part of why we do these sessions, break down that bill, is for us to start thinking about what we will do as I guess lay people. Unless there's politicians in watching my lives, there may be, I don't know. So that brings us to the next slide. We are really breezing through these, which is amazing. Okay, so what is next? As I mentioned, President Biden, I think he was in Massachusetts, and he made a presentation or speech about the executive actions he planned on taking regarding climate justice. But as I said, he stopped short of declaring a national emergency, which would give him more power to make that decision. So maybe that will happen in the future. Who knows? Hopefully. There's not really much that Congress can do because, again, we're waiting. Similar to other topics that we've addressed and break down that bill, we're waiting on the Senate. But ding, 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 what can you do? And this is actually, I'm really excited about this one, the next slide, because it's very much in the lane of communicating for health justice. I will be better about sharing some of these opportunities a little bit sooner. You'll see what I mean when I go to the next slide. Okay, so this is it's by the EPA. It's called the Let's Talk About Heat Challenge. Now, I'm sure, I don't even know, I don't think it even matters where you're located. We are currently all going through this heat wave. It's very hot. So please make sure you're drinking your water and you're inside when you need to. So this opportunity is very timely. This Let's Talk About Heat Challenge is a national competition to identify innovative and effective communication strategies that inform people of the risk of extreme heat and offer ways to keep safe during the hottest days. But it's all about that creativity, okay? And that's what we're about here at CFHJ. So, gentle, I guess, caveat, this is actually due today at midnight. So I will put the link after I post this, but it is due soon. So basically, I think I read the first part. Yeah. So to help address this need, again, we're all experiencing this very intense heat wave. The EPA and co-sponsors, which are linked in the link that I will share. I don't have it pinned here, but I will share it later. They're trying to basically collect through a challenge different innovative ways to communicate about the importance of, I guess, you can probably say heat safety. The challenge was developed in support of the National Climate Task Force Extreme Heat Interagency Working Group, which is being led by the EPA. Winning solutions will include identification of and engagement with people known to be the most susceptible to extreme heat risks, but not limited to underserved and overburdened communities. Winners will share suitable messages, strategies used to reach target audiences with those messages and proposed measures of effectiveness. Communication methods might include social media. So if you're great at social media, try that. Billboards, graphics, public service announcements, or other forms of communication. So it's all about communication. The challenge sponsors hope to identify ways to monitor the effectiveness of these heat risk campaigns and messages, then share the best practices with communities across the nation. So it's all about designing an intervention based on communication, but focusing on environmental justice, specifically heat safety. So again, it is due today at midnight. So, if you want to get a group together super quickly and, maybe you have a project that you've already worked on, take some time to do that. But it seems like a great project that is very much related to what we do here in my Community for Health Justice. So I definitely wanted to share it as your call to action. So if you watch this later, hopefully you watch it before the deadline and then you can participate. And they might have other opportunities as well. So just wanted to keep in mind. So we're coming to the end. Our favorite part, the activist action plan, always color coordinated. So last week, I believe it was pink. This week it's yellow. So this is just a link. I will link it later, but this is for you to keep track of your actions, your activist actions. How are you planning on positively contributing to the climate justice topic or the environmental justice topic? What resources do you plan on using? After today's, kind of introduction / mini workshop, what action items will you be taking to address this? That's what we use for the activist action plan. And if you have any questions ever, just send an email, communicateforhealthjustice@gmail.com. We do have 2 more of these sessions, and next week we will be focusing on the treatment, really, the treatment of Black women and girls. And so, because the way I view it, there are health implications of, biased treatment. And so we'll be looking at that. So hopefully folks can join for that one. I'm going to stop my share here. And yeah, finished at 5:42. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, folks. If you are watching this back later, again, feel free to reach out for any questions. Hopefully these breakdown that bill sessions inspire you to make some positive change. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Again, please stay safe. It's quite hot. But yeah, thank you. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one.